Hello and welcome to Page 29, the deeper look into the DePaulia's top headlines of the week. This is online managing editor Nate Burleson. Sitting with me is contributing writer Mo Dunn. Mo spoke with people around the city who work with Afghan refugees in a number of capacities, focusing on resettlement in the Chicago area. Mo, what made you want to pick up this story, and what were some of the challenges that you experienced while reporting on it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, obviously the situation in Afghanistan has been a really big subject in the headlines recently.
Mm-hmm.
And I know Chicago's in a unique position where we accept a lot of refugees. We have a very diverse city, and we have a lot of, we have a very strong social safety net, as well as like immigrant and refugee supports, whether that be through government and also like nonprofits.
Mm-hmm.
So I really wanted to dig into what that looked like, the Afghan refugee resettlement here in Chicago, because I wasn't really seeing that like necessarily reflected in bigger publications on like a granular level.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as issues I ran into, a lot of these agencies were really busy, and a lot of people could not talk to me just because of the volume of work that they had to do with this crisis and with the changing policies accepting more of these refugees.
Mm-hmm.
So I had trouble finding sources. Like many stories, but the people I was able to talk to were extremely helpful.
Yeah, and I mean, they were talking a lot. I mean, the events of August that led to an influx of refugees, especially coming to the Chicago area. How well were volunteers able to scramble together in those days? Because it's described in a bit in the article that they were scrambling to form teams of volunteers and that they were trying to get people together like right in August as everything was kind of happening in Afghanistan. Can you talk about how they scrambled in those just probably a week, 2 weeks maybe they had to prepare?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of my sources who works with the Catholic Charities directly within resettlement, so she essentially is their refugees point person as soon as they get to the U.S. and they arrive in Chicago. And a key difference between these Afghan arrivals that we're seeing is that these agencies, whether it be a private one like the Catholic Charities or other resettlement agencies, don't have the benefit of a lot of pre-planning and a lot of time. So each fiscal year, these organizations have a cap and a number of refugees that they will be responsible for resettling in Chicago with the Afghan Placement and Assistance Program, essentially that exceeded their cap. So they were accepting a lot more refugees than they normally do on a much tighter timetable. So essentially what that practically looked like was instead of having housing ready, because they like to place people in permanent homes, expedite that process of feeling at home in Chicago, they ended up putting many of the arrivals in extended stay hotels or other temporary living solutions. So that was a big difference with the scrambling there. But yeah, it was a bit overwhelming, I think, for a lot of these organizations.
Mm-hmm. And then, what is the extent of DePaul's relationship, like with Refugee One? How does DePaul get students involved helping with the refugee crisis?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in the article, I spoke with a couple of master's students who work full-time with refugee communities, one of whom was working with Catholic Charities, as I mentioned, not just with Afghan arrivals, but that's the main population of people coming in right now, but also within the Rohingya community, which is obviously a distinct refugee community, but one that's well established in Chicago as well. But as far as like undergrad involvement, DePaul does have relationships with a lot of these refugee nonprofits. And each week a team of students led by other students take a bus to Refugee One or even to the Rohingya Culture Center, which is also mentioned in the article, and they provide like mentorship, tutoring after school for children, and then just more so establishing relationships with people that may be new to the U.S.
Yeah, and I mean, you spoke on it a little bit, but why do you think Chicago itself is a good city for refugees to come to?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, first of all, Chicago is very diverse. We have we have a very vibrant community, very vibrant communities, I should say, of people from all over the world. And we have a lot of people to sponsor refugees coming in as well. And we also have a lot of nonprofits, as I mentioned, that works with resettlement and case management in that sense. And also Chicago is a sanctuary city as well, which doesn't apply to every refugee communities necessarily, but that does make it a very welcoming city for a lot of people in the world.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of just like, in general, there's a lot of neighborhoods, like you mentioned, Devon Avenue, there's a lot of small businesses and stuff there. You talk like I feel like Chicago. It's a good city for this to happen, but it's also a good city, to find volunteers in, because Chicago does kind of have the mindset of helping people out. Did you notice how much of the impact of the work that the volunteers were doing? How much of that impact were you able to see? Were you able to talk to any refugees who have been helped with? I know there's a lot of and there's not a lot of contact with refugees specifically in this article. It's more of a focus on the volunteers, but were you able to see a lot of the results of what they were doing?
Yeah, so for this article specifically, as I mentioned, a lot of people are overwhelmed and busy right now with that influx of refugees.
Mm-hmm.
And you're right, I did not interview any Afghan refugees for this story, and that's because a lot of people are getting acclimated to
Right.
Chicago right now. I don't necessarily want to swoop in and overwhelm anyone, and it's also a very traumatizing experience, everything that they've been through.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't necessarily want to step in and make them rehash that to me or speak about that at the moment. I agree it's important to raise awareness and hear directly from refugees. That was not the piece for that now.
No, I agree. Yeah.
But so I didn't necessarily want to do that. A couple of the caseworkers as well were kind of like. And I spoke with a couple of professors as well, and they were like, this is very traumatizing.
Yeah.
We don't want to, publish anyone's name necessarily after they arrive. But to answer your question, I did speak with a volunteer with Refugee One, and she is created over the course of her years since she was a freshman, all the way to her senior year now, relationships with some of the kids at Refugee One, just sort of being a friend to them overall, and also providing academic support and such. Something that stuck out to me that she mentioned was, shifting to virtual, spending virtual time with the kids. She'd pre-record videos and interactive things for them to do at home instead of her being able to physically be with them. So I think, and another thing as well with one of my sources mentioned was a lot of these Afghan arrivals have had their college careers interrupted right now from this crisis that they found themselves in, and then they're in a new country now. And she really stressed that DePaul students specifically can be really helpful in terms of mentoring students or other college kids that may be arriving here. Yeah,
it's mentioned in the article that about 3% of refugees access higher education, and the UN's goal is about 15%. How can DePaul students help reach that goal?
Yeah, absolutely. One of my sources pointed that out to me as well. That's a global statistic here, because I think, a lot of refugee communities face really unique struggles before they come to the U.S. here. And that's something I spoke with someone from the Rohingya Culture Center about. For example, the Rohingya people are persecuted and are victims of genocide in Myanmar. And they're considered stateless people by the United Nations, which means they're unable to attend public school or any public services. So a lot of people that are coming to Chicago in the Rohingya community, their traditional language is not written. So it's very hard to learn English. It's very hard to, learn to write and read, because that's just not something that they had access to in Myanmar. So I think, starting, whether it be tutoring kids at the Rohingya Culture Center who are in elementary school, on getting those skills up, or even just providing support and mentorship to older refugees as well, trying to, help them get more involved with our educational system here.
If you would like to get involved or learn more about the situation, Catholic Charities of Chicago is seeking student volunteers to mentor and assist refugees with getting acclimated to Chicago, academic support, and other resettlement needs. Visit Catholic Charities of Chicago's websites to find an opportunity to assist, or email resettlement caseworker Emily Parker directly at eparker@catholiccharities.net. The Rohingya Culture Center is seeking student volunteers for its academic support program, youth soccer club, English learning support, and assistant with nonprofit administration. Volunteering with Refugee One can be coordinated through the Depaul group on DHub. Visit Refugee One's student group on DHub or their website at refugeeone.org. For the next story, news editor Nadia Hernandez looked into anti-racism efforts in the theater school and the fulfillments and shortcomings made on the promises from administration last summer. Nadia, can you talk about the original anti-racism message from the theater school and where they vowed for change in the first place?
Yeah, so the original statement was published back in 2020, right around June or July, and that was kind of a response to all of the racial and social justice movements happening nationwide. And the performance arts community and theater community also kind of had their own mini movement in their respective performing arts.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I talked to the dean and the diversity advisor, they even said too, like, this was their response to also that larger trend. And some of the stuff they, I guess, outlined in their statement was doing more training for faculty and students and staff, having spaces for students of color to air their grievances and talk about their experiences.
Like open discussions?
Yeah, like open discussions, like kind of making sure that they like can have a space to do that. And just also too, like holding themselves accountable and creating committees to do and like break up that work, I guess, as well.
And then what tipped you off on the story? Why publish this now?
Well, this statement has been up for a year, and I guess we wanted to check in and see what progress had been made and seeing how students felt, because obviously that is a really big commitment to make, and obviously you should be taking action, whether it's short-term and long-term, but I guess mostly checking into seeing on the admin side how they felt and how they were working towards it, and students how they felt and whether they were actually seeing change on their part.
Did you have any students like approach you, or did you see any students like airing out their problems somewhere else before this story came out? Or
I hadn't really seen anything on social media, but I did reach out to, I believe it's like the Latinx artist at the theater school, and I had asked them like, hey, would anyone want to talk about this or anything they've experienced? And from there, the guy I was talking to was like, yeah, let me ask around, and he gave me like a list of people who were willing to, and so that was really cool to get in touch with a lot of people.
Yeah, and a lot of times with these like more touchy subjects and stories where people might be talking, poorly about administration, they don't want to have their name behind it. They don't want their name to be published. But you didn't have any anonymous sources for it. Did you just not have any problems with anyone who felt like they needed to be anonymous when they were talking bad about the administration or talking against them?
I mean, I did have a conversation with my source because this was the first time they were talking about the admin and their experience, and it did make them nervous. And obviously, like, I completely understand that. And I think overall, since they didn't say anything specific, or at least specific about, like, a certain person or anything, I think it's perfectly fine to then be critical of your program. I don't see how that can be something where...
True, it does happen, though. It does happen. People don't really want to talk about it right off the way.
Yeah, and especially because, like, I guess theater is a culture of connections, similar to journalism, so I could understand where they felt like they could have jeopardized their, I guess, standing.
Yeah, and I mean, speaking about that, it makes it a unique school on campus because it's, performance-based, which means you're competing for spots in the performance. So you might not want to step on anybody's toes. You want to be able to go through it cleanly. So what makes the theater school a more unique place for these anti-racism efforts compared to a non-performance school?
I think what makes the theater school a little different is the fact that it is a performing arts school in Chicago, and I think, like, historically looking at Chicago, the city has been a huge, I guess, place for a lot of these social justice movements to even occur because of its population demographics. And so looking at the theater school, like, you do have it kind of like in this really nice area. And Chicago also too is like known for theater. Like we have like Broadway on Chicago, and that really, I guess, kind of intersects where social justice and then culture and politics and then going into that how is that then manifested in performing arts?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that kind of makes it unique as rather than I guess not a performing arts school, because art is a tool for social justice, I guess. So that's something, I guess.
That's all for page 29. You can read Mo and Nadia's articles at DePauliaOnline.com or pick up a copy of the paper in one of the newsstands on the Lincoln Park or Loop campus. This has been Nate Burleson for the DePaulia.